So let's start with question number 5. How can we do load testing using Visual Studio Team System Test? Now, before we go ahead and we talk about load testing using Visual Studio Team System, one of the prerequisite of the load test is that we should have some kind of test, either a web test or either a unit test. So what we'll do is that in question number 4, we had created a simple web test using the login screen. So we'll be using the same web test as an input to our load test. So in case you have come to this video directly, what you can do is that you can go back to question number 4, look into the video, and then come to this video. So we have the prerequisite now. Now let's go ahead and see that how we can create a load test. So right click on the Visual Studio Test project, add new test, and select load test. Let's give a name to this, nice name to this, called as login load test. Now once you click OK, it will pop up a wizard which will help you to provide inputs for the load test. So let's do a next. The first input to the load test which we need to specify is that is a scenario name. So let's give a nice scenario to this. Let's say login scenario. Now you can see that there is something called as a think time profile. So let's try to understand that what is basically think time in load test. So here's a simple scenario where the user wants to fill an invoice form. So the user requests to the server saying that he wants to fill the invoice form. The server sends a invoice form to the user. The user starts filling the form. So probably it takes 2 or 3 minutes to fill the invoice form. The user submits the filled form to the server. The server processes the invoice form and sends a response to the user. Now the time taken by the user to fill the invoice form is nothing but a think time. So in other words, the time between the request, the time taken by the user to respond between the request is called as a think time. Now there are 3 options by which you can specify think time. The first one is that do not use think times. So in this option, the think time is completely ignored between the request. Now this option basically helps you to generate maximum load on your server, but it completely ignores the way your user interacts with the web server. So definitely if you want to really get a realistic picture of your load test, then this option should be avoided. But you can select this option in case you want to just generate maximum load on your server. Now the second option is use recorded think times. Now in this option, the think times is used exactly how it was recorded in the web test. Now probably it looks very promising that yes, this is a very realistic think time, because as we have recorded, we are using the same think time. Probably it will generate a more realistic load test, but it doesn't, because the think time is constant, and the way the load test works is that it basically just fires like 300 or 400 users, 400 virtual users. So what happens is that it generates a very unnatural load pattern with a very synchronized virtual user. So because of this, it doesn't really generate doesn't really generate a realistic load test. So again, you can use this option when you want to generate a very unnatural load pattern. But in case you want a realistic load pattern, then this should be avoided. The last and the final one is use normal distribution. In normal distribution, the think time is varied. It is varied by the VSTS test, and the think time is spread across a normal curve. So what happens is, because of this, a more realistic simulation of virtual user is done, rather than when we use the do not use think times, or we use the recorded think times as it is. So at this moment we will select this option, use normal distribution, and we'll click next. Now there are 2 ways by which you can generate a load pattern. One is that you can either have a constant load, saying that okay, I want to just generate a constant load of 100 users. The other one is that you can have a step load. So in other words, you can start with saying 10 users, 20 users, 30 users. So you can basically have a step load kind of pattern, or we can have a variable load kind of a scenario. So depending on your requirement, you can select one of them. So at this point we'll just select constant load. Now in a given load test, you can have one or many web tests. So for example, in one load test you can probably have a web test which consists of a login screen web test. You can also have, in the same load test, you can also have probably a invoice application load web test. So in other words, probably you can have 2 or 3 web tests or unit tests in one load test. Now test mix model basically helps you to specify that which test should be running first, or it helps you to determine which test is run depending on certain criteria. So if you have one or many web tests or unit tests in a single load test, test mix model has three parameters, as you can see on the screen, which helps you to determine which test should be running first. So let me just pull up a small PPT here, and let me keep this screen at the right hand side, at just below, so that we can understand the theory as well as we can understand what these options are. So let's take the first test, the first criteria of from the test mix model, based on total number of tests. Now what does that mean? Let's say you have test A, test B and test C in your load testing solution. Now depending on the percentage allocated to these tests, the next test is started. So you can see that test B has the maximum allocated percentage. So when one test is run, the next test decision which test to start depends on the percentage. So when it runs test B, you will say, okay, which is the next test which should be run? He will say C because it is 20% and he is 10%. So depending on the percentage allocated to the test, the next test is selected. Now the next criteria which test mix model helps us to specify is based on number of virtual user. So this model determines the percentage of virtual user who will run the test. So now the criteria selection, that which test should be run next, is not only based on the percentage allocated to the test, but also to the percentage of virtual user which are allocated to the test. So when this model is selected, the next test is not only decided on the test percentage, but also on the percentage virtual user allocated to the test. The third criteria which test mix model gives us is the based on user pace. So in case you want to not only set now based on percentage of the number of virtual user and the test, but you also want to set the rate of test execution for each virtual user, you can use this option. So for example, if you want to say that okay, test A should run 4 tests per user per hour, if you want to specify test B should run 2 tests per user per hour. So if you want to specify the rate of test execution, then you can use this test mix model. So the first one was based on the total number of tests, second one was based on the total number of virtual user allocated to the test, and third one is more based on the rate of test execution. So currently we will select total number of test percentage. Let's do a next. Now in the test mix, we need to specify basically which web test or which unit test we want to run in this load test. So as we had already discussed that we're going to use the login screen web test. So let me select that. I'm not going to specify other tests, but in case I'm interested to also put a unit test and other web tests, I can always do that. But at this moment, let me just specify only one test over here. The next screen then pops up saying that which browser are you going to use for this load test. So at this moment, just let me keep it Internet Explorer 7.0. The network mix option helps me to specify that what kind of network I want to use for this load test. So at this moment, I'm just going to keep it LAN because it's running currently in my same PC. The next one is more related to performance counters. So while running the load test, if you want to really add some performance counters which you want to measure and view during your load test, you can specify that. And the final one is a run settings. Now run setting basically helps you to specify saying what are the warm-up duration, run duration. Okay, let me just talk about it. Warm-up duration is basically when you run one test, and you want to say that after the test you want to just give some kind of a halt period or a pause period. That's a warm-up duration. So for example, let's say that you run one load test of one virtual user, and then you want to just make a halt and say that okay, just wait for 10 seconds and then again run the second load test. So warm-up duration is nothing but it's a pause between tests. Run duration basically specifies saying that how much time do you want this load test to run. We also have something called as a test iteration. Now test iteration basically helps you to specify saying that what kind of validation level do you see, or what kind of validation level you want to run the web test on. For example, when you actually make a web test, okay, let's go to web test to understand this. So when we actually do a web test, so here's our web test. In web test we have specified the validation rules. Now in the validation rule you can see that there is something called as a level. Now this level is nothing but it specifies a validation rule level, saying that is it high, is it low, or is it medium. Okay, so when we actually specify the load test, So when we actually run, or when we actually run the load test, the run settings basically helps you to say that which kind of validation level do you want to check for this test. So that's the validation level. So once you click finish, you should get something like this as you see on your screen. So basically you should get the various parameters your load test has, which are specified through the wizard, and you can get the run settings also. Now let's do one thing. Let's run this load test and let's click OK. Now as soon as you start running the load test, it starts showing you a graphical view of how your test is actually running. So you can see that at the right hand side, it's showing you basically how the page response time is with, as you know, for every virtual user, and it's also showing you some other key indicators. Now what we'll do is that let's look at the textual data rather than looking at the graphical data, because in that way things can be much clearer. So you can see that the user load is 25 is the max. So it's basically going to fire 25 virtual user. The request per second it's going to make is 10. So 10 requests per second will be fired. The average response time currently, on average, we can see that 0.039 seconds is taken to load the page, the login page. And then currently we do not have any kind of errors or threshold violations. Now let me do one thing. Let me just stop the test here so that I can show you the summary. And this summary page is also displayed when you basically finish your load test. So let's stop this at this moment so that we can quickly see the summary page. Now once you click yes, you will see that it shows a complete summary of how your load test actually worked. So it's showing here the overall results, saying that the max user load was 25. The request per second to the page was made was 4 requests per second. Nothing failed, nothing was cached. The average response time was 0.02 seconds, and this is very important. So now you need to go back to the user and say that, hey, the average response time of our project is 0.02 seconds, and is that what meets your user acceptance criteria? And then you can see other things like how much time the average the test took, and how much time the average page time took, and etc. So in this way you can know the results of your load test. I hope that this session was useful, and in the coming up sessions we are going to see more on database testing, and we'll also see how we can do code coverage.